So what I was thinking about, the original impulse of this lecture or this PowerPoint was to try and think through modernity, not just as a kind of category of a sort of period and a timeline and a kind of theory of what it is, but rather speculate on the fact that um, there's a modernity which runs through other cultures, or the look of modernity which runs through other cultures, which isn't named as modernity, but um, speaks to a kind of heterogeneity of time, a kind of displacement of time, as if modernity on the level of its style, its look, isn't unique to the West. Um, where I'm going to go. So this sense of the otherness of modernity. And so these are my words: abstraction, autonomy, apparatus, critique, avant-garde, destination, finality, reduction, progress, disenchantment, unconscious, the other. So is modernity a kind of code for something? Is it a code which runs through from the Enlightenment through to the Romantics and the idea of the work of art being double, a kind of a thing which is also a speculation on a thing? Is it an idea of utopian possibility, a horizon of something? Is it, are we now leaving modernity? Do we need another name for this phenomena of transition that we might be making? So modernity are gauged out of, or as a consequence of the Enlightenment and the philosophy of reason, various figures and codes were developed to provide a framework of coherence which served to structure a sense of integrated imaginary, or period out of which a theory of temporality was developed. So is it a theory of temporality? Is it a code of reason? Is it a disenchantment of the world? Is it a sense of autonomy of art? Is it a new way of understanding the temporality and production of difference? Well, Peter Osborne says modernity is a beautiful feeling of time, mysterious statement, but one which puts into place both modernity and a sense of time, which is also a sense of aesthetic feeling. So is modernity also the birth of aesthetic emotion, aesthetic theory, which is its unique characteristic? And so I take this journey into the other of modernity and think, well, a lot of the characteristics which are characterized as modern in terms of visual syntax have already occurred. So go back to the year 1200, around the year 1200, and look at the artist Ma Yuan, who did these album paintings which are in Beijing, in the museum in Beijing, of just studies of water, and there's no horizon. There's just the phenomenon of water, but there's no real figure and ground relationship. So he just observed a single element without any other figural component. On one level, they're paintings of emptiness, or at least condition of something being an image. In the first part of the 19th century, John Constable explored the appearance of skies and clouds. This influenced Impressionism, and with it, pure observation. So this idea of empirical vision, or the looking at a single entity, is not new to modernity, but it's very much part of its impulse. So we see John Constable's sky study.
Hey, sorry to interrupt you, Jonathan. Leo's trying to get into the room. He says, "What's the password to the room?" Which wasn't. I didn't need a password to get in, but he's obviously stuck. He's not waiting to be admitted, is he?
It might be waiting to be admitted. I've just got to go out of the box. Oh, it's a nuisance. How do I get out of the box now?
Because I'm co-host, I don't see him on the waiting to be admitted. So
Was there a password with the original. Can you see that, Lester?
Yeah, I'll actually, yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, let me see how to do that.
I mean, it should just come up as enter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when
so
it says
yeah,
password, I think it normally does
yeah. Hang
that
on.
bit.
Just let me just put it in the chat.
Oh, it's come. Look, someone's just come in, so it would come up in my screen.
Can you see it there, Jess, in the chat?
Yeah. Okay, I'll pass it on. Thanks.
So Kantian philosophy is underscored by a turn towards the subject. It's what's known as the subjective turn in philosophy. And this, in a way, opens the space for modernity. And with it, the question of how the subject comes to know. With this, the binary relationship is established between the perceiving subject and the intended object. And a quote from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the first critique: the I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all, which is not, which is as much to say that the representation would either be impossible or else would be nothing for me. So also there's a kind of sense of a subject which is, there's some things which are knowable and some things which are not. So the subject is already constituted as a divided subject. It's almost a price you have to pay for the subjective turn. So this is moving forward from Mayuan to Hiroshi Sugimoto, which no doubt was inspired by Mayuan. So sort of something like Anya's coming in. So, and it shows that there's a sort of almost a modernity to Buddhist philosophy, which is non-binary. So Hiroshi Sugimoto produced a whole series of photographs of oceans which mix together appearance, time, and being. As images, they reoccasion an archaic sense of appearance emerging out of nothing and then dissolving back into nothing. In this way, they restage the feeling of a temporality that is both before and after modernity or modernism. There's an artist called Mai Lin, who was the son of Ma Yuan, so Southern Song dynasty, which is 12th, 13th century. Mai Lin captures the relationship between appearance of nature with the feeling of mist mixing with the fragrance of spring. His means for achieving this is black ink on white surface in which the mark making link together the working of mind and nature. So this non-binary conception of a sort of loop between mind and nature. And this takes us forward. The first sense of a sparseness which you find in Sung paintings is Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea, which is early 19th century, the first part of the 19th century. But here we see a double encoding of the idea of sublimity and the infinite. And an oil sketch by Turner. So again, this feeling of interweaving of the elements and a sparse relationship between figure and ground, an almost disappearing relationship of either the monk by the sea or the boat in the stormy ocean. Romantic poetry and painting and poetry invested in an elevated relationship to the cosmos and discovered the process of an infinity with the imaginary of classical Chinese paintings and poetry. The connection is incidental, but nonetheless compelling in terms of tonalities and phrasings. It is as if history contains a storehouse of images which might be reoccasioned at any time. History is understood as a sequence of casual links and documents, but there's also a network which is not rendered visible, which comes into play as a form of virtuality. So I wonder, I mean, my speculation is I wonder if within visual syntax and memory, whether it's continuous, it's not some the artifice of periodization and codification of period is pre-occasioned by the sort of archetypes of memory, as it were. There's a pool of information within the world which is accessible outside of period. This is an artist, southern song artist called Mi Chu, Six Persimmons. So there's no discernible frame for this painting. There's no table that the fruit sits on. It could be that the fruit are also a product of mind, that there's both the unity of observing of a empirical event, a set of persimmons sitting together. But are they a mental event? Is it a mental image, or is it a physical image? Is it actual or is it virtual? It kind of seems to hint at this by the displaced fruit. You don't know where it is in space. Is it in front of, or is it in between the space? So there's no visible support for these fruits, which appear to be floating in space, and there is a sense that mind and matter are without distinction. And just to emphasize the idea of the look of things, this is a 17th century Ming pair of dining tables or support tables that have the look of, for all intents and purposes, if you saw these without any sense of art history or design history, you'd think they were modernist. So Ming Dynasty furniture has many of the design and craft features of modernist modes or models, including truth to materials, elegance, and purity. But is not this invested in the notion of style? Again, Ming Dynasty. This is 17th century, early 17th century. It could be 16th century. And this is a Scandinavian 20th century furniture, which has the same type of sparseness and the same sort of elegance. Leonardo's admitted now, found his way in. The Scandinavian modernist furniture shares with Chinese Ming furniture many formal features such as purity of form, truth of materials, visual elegance, but they come out of quite different, distinct philosophical frameworks. So why does something look like something but doesn't share similar origin? This is the Ming chair, and these are all the they made the Ming furniture was made out of pure wood without any nails or screws or any artificial joins. They were joined by very elaborate joinery system, which were almost like a work of art in itself. Then we have Chinese monochrome porcelain, which originates in the Ming Dynasty and culminates in highly refined artifacts of the 17th century Ming dish. And this is the niche Kapoor. And niche Kapoor was both influenced by the modernist idea of the monochrome, but also the Chinese monochrome porcelain he saw in the Percival David collection. The technology of realization might be different, but the visual matrix is not so apart. So here we have a kind of example of simulation of a look which is outside of period, but without necessarily an acknowledgement that that's the case. I don't think he's ever talked about monochrome porcelain, but he's seen it. So again, it's 17th century imperial yellow. but again, a look which you think is outside of art history and outside of design history, you'd think was completely 20th century. You wouldn't think these such vibrant colors existed within the 17th century. If you look at the dyes which were available in Europe at that time, pretty bleak. So China experienced a broken or discontinuous modernity. The 20th century was occupied by wars, famines, revolutions, and isolation. Its political and economic isolation eased in 1949, which coincided with the beginnings of globalism and neoliberal economics in the West. Yet within this memory system of China, there are aesthetic manifestations that predate Western modernity. So in a sense, China had some of its initial almost touching upon a modernity which was never realized already by the by the Sung in the 12th, 13th century. There were always the features of industrial revolution, which they kind of stepped on by. They decided not to take that route, but they had very advanced navy, metalwork, large-scale ceramic production, metalwork, writing skills, a lot of the features which went into the Industrial Revolution in the West. They had much early on, they had a bureaucracy, a very refined educational bureaucratic class. This is, we think about the Renaissance, this is equivalent to the Renaissance. The screen dates from the equivalent to the Renaissance, but it exhibits qualities much closer to those of early modernity, particularly the watercolor landscapes of Paul Cézanne. Here is a late watercolor by Cézanne. There's a kind of sparse visuality, a kind of interpenetration of absence and presence, of visibility and invisibility. So traditional Japanese architecture has a profound impact upon modernist design culture with its strict employment of geometry, distribution of light, and regulation of empty space. The interior spaces of Japanese architecture explore the limits of what in late modernity became known as minimalism, whereas whilst being culturally isolated from the West. So this is from the Edo period.
But I think, Jonathan, just because it's an area of interest of mine, obviously, but I think the Japanese look on things is that the emptiness space was actually a physical and positive thing, whereas perhaps in modernist thinking, empty space was more of a negative. So I think there was a slight difference of emphasis in Japanese thought.
I'm not saying they're the same or even that they go together as a unity. I'm just saying that there's a look which we would, again, without knowing, identify as modernist features of spatial congruence, without them being unities of sense. So something was happening in Japan which was in advance of the West or outside of modernity, but nevertheless had features which we could call modern in some way. And indeed, they do exert an influence upon modernist design. This is Enso from the Edo, again, the Edo period of the 18th century. It's a single gestural mark which is without translation. Could be everything comes from emptiness and goes back into emptiness, or things are not as they appear nor are they otherwise, or any number of what is the sound of one hand clapping, any numbers of paradoxical statements. It's a sort of almost a 1 second drawing which takes a lifetime to achieve. This is the artist Robert Motherwell. And in post-war Manhattan particularly, there was a profound and in the West Coast as well, sort of influence of Japanese ink painting. So he had affinities with Zen and Far Eastern calligraphy. In some cases, it was purely a formal relationship, but in some cases, it was also philosophical. Robert Motherwell had a sustained relationship to Zen ink paintings, and Bryce Marden, in his Cold Mountain series, discovered within Chinese calligraphic poems a new approach to mark making. This is Bryce Marden, was the next generation, sort of started off as a monochrome painter in the 60s, but turned increasingly towards the mark making of Chinese calligraphy. These marks don't have any, they're not to be read, they're to be seen, but they have this tension between the original poetic inscriptions and his rendering of the marks, which are calligraphic. The Edo tea, pair of Edo tea bowls, Edo period tea bowls, which again we identify this look as being very much to do with European studio pottery. As Bernard Leach researched Japanese and Korean pottery and introduced both examples and techniques into studio pottery movement into modernist practices. Spelled practices wrong. To go back over that. So this kind of idea of truth to materials is not particularly original to modernity. Here's Charles Baudelaire in the mid-19th century, second part of the 19th century. Modernity is transitory, the fugitive, the contingent, which make up one half of art, the other being the eternal and the immutable. This transitory, fugitive element, which is constantly changing, must not be despised or neglected. This idea of two different codings of time, the transitory and the eternal, being a component feature of early modernity. And when Paul Gauguin went to the South Seas, to Tahiti, on his adventure to escape bourgeois France and his family, he took with him images of Javanese sculpture and Egyptian paintings and Japanese woodblock prints. He almost had an image in his mind of the paradise he was going to find, and constructed a space as much within his imaginary than it is in reality. In fact, he in some way ignored his own personal misery, his condition. He didn't find paradise, he found his own misery, but didn't reflect that in his work. So in his paintings of Tahiti, Gauguin appeared to want to arrest the passage of modern time with the temporality of circular drifting. There is within this collision of the reality principle, colonial domination being erased from depiction. Symbolist art plays itself on the side of the dream, just as surrealist art opened out the continent of the unconscious. This is typical, this is from Borobudur, this is 10th, 11th century Javanese sculpture, Buddhist sculpture. It's still got kind of incredible paradisal feeling to it. Animals and fruits and Buddha sitting at the center. A kind of sense of a visual template of otherness, of escape from time, as if passage of time doesn't really occur. It's a very circular motion of time. This is the Ottoman period, 16th, 17th century Ottoman robe. And Ottoman textiles were found in Renaissance Italy. They were trading through Venice, through Constantinople and Venice, but often the designs themselves become interchangeable. So there's historians who don't know anymore what's Ottoman and what's Renaissance. So there's a close connection built up between the Ottoman world and Renaissance Italy, to the extent that some of the textiles are so close in appearance and technique as to be so like the certainty of designation is rendered uncertain. This William Morris, sort of Art Nouveau, not William Morris, arts and crafts or Art Nouveau design. Art Nouveau awakened the sense not of only decorative arts, but also the weave of nature and aesthetic emergence. So there's a fascination with the cultures of the West that provided a different visual syntax to that of the tradition emerging purely out from the Renaissance. So modernity was also a kind of a disavowal of a single tradition. It opened itself out for other traditions. So it's a heterogeneous passage of time. Didn't necessarily continue the Western. In fact, it's a disavowal of the main inheritance from the Greeks, which is the mimetic principle. And typically, someone like Matisse collected a lot of Eastern, particularly Eastern textiles. And it enabled him to sort of think in terms of an all-overness, a kind of merger between pattern and figure, and a flattening out of space into pattern. So the figure-ground relationship gets lost in an overall pattern. We see this also in painters like Vaulois and Bonnard. This is a 19th century Central Asian ikat, velvet ikat. So it's dyed before woven. That gives it its fuzzy feeling. But these are the sorts of visual templates that attracted artists like Matisse. So it's a visual language based on intensity and repetition, which influenced artists such as Matisse in their quest for a pictorial vibrancy within the world depicted without shadow. So the sense of a world without shadow comes from Japanese woodblock prints, comes from textiles, comes from Mughal miniatures and Islamic miniatures, and again, a couple of ikats, Central Asian ikats. These are in the V&A. You got Picasso. So part of Picasso's anti-mimetic gesture was to open out the relationship to archaic and African art. It wasn't just African art, it was also early Spanish sculpture, as well as Egyptian art he looked at. This in part enabled him to connect with the energetics of the encounter related to the subject beyond the binary code of appearance and essence. Thus, the work of art could become a cipher for forces which propel the impulse to create. So the anti-mimetic impulse, the coding of appearance and essence, the sense of things as they really are, is disavowed for the relationship to the forces which accompany the appearance of a figure. We need to think also within modernity about the division of the self and the other. And I go to the figure of Jacques Lacan, who articulated the idea of the other into two registers, the lowercase other and the uppercase other. The little other designates the imaginary ego, which underscores its alienating influence, dimension rather. So imaginary is a realm of illusion, but it's also a realm of alienation, of a subject becoming lost within a sense of not being able to discover what it is. When relating to alter egos, it is done through the mediation of what is imagined. The capital other refers to the transient individual register, such as exemplified by the relationship to state, authority, history, God, nature, and the Queen. There is also a capital other that relates to the real, which is constituted as the unfathomable abyss of the unknowability. This implies a non-symmetrical relationship between the self and the other, and is in part of the way in which the subject is decentered. Modernist aesthetic forms mirrored both the journey into alienation and knowability. through its appropriation of cultural models deemed to be outside the Western canon. So this is the Modigliani, and it's sort of it's one of his potential visual influences in African sculpture of the 19th century. Modernity can be understood as a rationalizing process which overturns modernity, but within this releases new forces of subjectification, alienation, and fetishism. Early modernist portraits mobilize this push and pull of the encounter by exposing the dynamic towards subjective otherness. Following this tendency, the portraits of Modigliani both express remoteness and intimacy at the same time. So as if we get a kind of internalization of the binary, which they're trying to escape. They're trying to escape the distinction of pig and ground relationship as part of that anti-mimetic impulse, but also they're trying to come to terms with this division of self and other. Moving back and sideways, this is a diagram by Robert Flood, who created a black square in 1617 in an attempt to capture infinity. This is saw as a representation of freedom. Likewise, Malevich followed the same gesture. So this is within the Renaissance, there's almost these moments where something's positive, which we kind of think of as being modern, but also mystical or esoteric. The two presentations of black squares are centuries apart, yet seem to be based upon a similar insight about the absolute of infinity. So we have these figures which move across time and not necessarily congruent with the time they're in. This is a Shiva Lingam from southern Thailand from the 7th, 8th century in the pre-Khmer times, when Cambodia and Thailand were one entity. So Brancusi served to redefine sculpture towards forms that communicated elemental modes of becoming. So this is Brancusi's torso with a young girl from 1922. This is Khmer Rouge, a Khmer ruin. These were the largest temple complexes in the world in the 10th, 11th century, vast in scale. Max Ernst visited in the mid-30s. He went to Indochina with the poet Paul Eluard and Gola, his wife, in a menage a trois. And they broke up, I think, in Saigon, and Max Ernst went off into the jungle in Cambodia and saw the ruins of the Khmer temples, and saw within these ruins not only the abandonment of a city, but a kind of sense of a foreboding passage towards the end of the world, or a kind of nightmare of the end of Europe after the rain, he called it, where the temples were consumed by the growth of the jungle. It's as if vast civilizations could just disappear back into nature. So you envisage war like a process of metamorphosis in which buildings become not just ruins, but metamorphose into formations more like natural formations, or becoming natural formations again. Going back even more remotely, this is Fayam portraits from around the time of Christ, maybe 1st century AD, it could be 1st century BC. And it's as if that look comes back to us through Giacometti's work. Giacometti was fascinated by Egyptian artifacts. He went to the Louvre regularly, and rather than looking at African artifacts, he looked at Egyptian, and saw within them a sort of culture of the dead, and saw this look, this haunting, eternal look into the kind of region of otherness. Jean Genet, the poet and playwright, said famously that Giacometti doesn't paint the living or paint for the living, he paints for the dead. They reverse the temporality of modernity away from the horizon of a purely realized utopian becoming into this region of the lost realm of the dead, and he also took this sense of mortality which linked to the gaze of eternity or the realm of the afterlife within the representation. And it was this dimension that provided his work with a visual intensity outside of the orbit of everyday perception. So again, it's this realm of otherness which occurs in different ways within modernity. And it links them back to a visuality which is not within modernity itself, but is outside of modernity in another time. Another artist who went back to the archaic realm is Ty Twombly, who moved from America to live in Rome and looked very closely at Roman arts of the ancient period and Greek art of the ancient period. Reference to Bacchus. So he referred to ancient classical sources with a feeling of calligraphic mark making. Writing and painting were linked in his works with a feeling of emergent space of aesthetic becoming. Aesthetically, his work was modernist, but intellectually, he was a classicist. And here we have the work of Howard Hodgkin, who had one of the most substantial collections of Indian art. And he clearly drew upon the intensity of color relationships. But there's also a pursuit of a mood. Indian aestheticians called it rasa. So each color was a rasa, gave rise to a feeling, a memory of a feeling. So in a way, he pursued this idea of not just color relations, but also rasa, which gives rise to a memory of something, an archaic memory, and stimulates the body into effective encounter. So there's erotic, heroic. So they've got different names, these rasa. There's about 12, 13 different rasas, but most of them relate to chakras in the body. So color is an effective relationship to triggering chemicals within the body which stimulate memory. And he had this way of being with his paintings for a long time, for months, if not years. The process of being with paintings became the means of revealing chains and loops within the process of recovering memory traces linked to either place or subjective encounter. And then we have the feeling within modernity that not just a displacement into the past, but also an anticipation of a future yet to come. And a sense that even the reversal of temporalities or a kind of peculiar coextensivity of memories, which there's a sort of reference in Deleuze in his book on Foucault, where he says the Greeks had a particular kind of memory, which is a memory of the future. This is a still from Le Jeté by Chris Marker, the combat necklace he wore at the start of the war, of that is yet to come. So he's pointing, this is from 1962, he writes this script, but he's pointing to a way of understanding a temporality which is so paradoxical and so outside of rationalism as to be incomprehensible. But we're witness to a scenario at the end of the World War III. The only hope of remaining survivors is to contact representatives from outer space, and these they need someone with exceptional memory in order to travel through time. The film itself serves to destroy notions of a linear construction to time, ending at its beginning. So the end is the beginning. So in a way, you get this aporia. The film opens at a moment on Orley Pier and ends with him looking at the moment of his own death. So there's no escape from him. So it stages this escape, this idea of escape from time. But for him, there's no escape. That is coming to be within the time of the film is also his moment of death. So you can't quite understand the paradox of this. This is still from Jean-Luc Godard. Godard died in the week. Died on the same day as the Queen, I believe. Age of 92, he died in Switzerland. But this is from his history of cinema, a sort of montage. And it's a lament for the death of modernist cinema. His 4.5 hour documentary film, Histoire de Cinema, employs montage to analyze the passing of the formal devices which create and therefore fold the history back on itself. So he's looking at the fold which is gone within modernity. So there is within this figure a structure of post-modernity or of circulating around time itself. So modernity, rather than giving rise to an horizon, finishes up by circulating a circulation of time around itself. So modernity served not only as a rupture within the academic tradition of modernist art, but also within this was able to develop another relationship outside of this ossified reality. This is both an impulse towards the production of the new, but with this, the restoration of memory chains that are imminent within such an impulse. So often it's the production of the new that is a sign of modernity, but isn't it also the case that the restoration of memory, that there's both within the production of the new a forgetting, but also an impulse towards a restoration. And another sequence here is the Mesopotamian prayer tower very early. Bruegel's Tower of Babel from the sort of Renaissance period, 1534. But Bruegel's Tower of Babel, even Frank Lloyd's structure for the Guggenheim Museum, share formal elements, but within historical context could not be further apart. So is modernity a period of historical self-reflection upon the formal feature that mixes together memory and amnesia in equal measure? So to reiterate, modernity was constructed around an anti-mimetic impulse with a tendency towards abstraction. This in turn opened out a route into appropriation of other cultural forms, which is not engaged with this within a model of reality built on mimetic foundations. And with this objectification, this pattern of cultural appropriation was linked to self-representations and the primacy of effective encounters. This is escape from the museum, attempt to go outside of the ossification of museum, which seems to be the fate of modernist art, is to finish up in a memory palace, which is also called a museum. Central America pyramid. The sculptor Robert Smithson was fascinated by Mesoamerica archaic art, and with it the visual syntax of ziggurat spirals and visual charts or diagrams. With this, they took outside the museum in order to relate directly to the land and related this to the mapping of time outside the narrow definitions of modernist temporality. So in the work of Smithson, we get one of the most self-conscious resistances to modernist time. a way of trying to reconfigure time and reconfigure the relationship of sculpture to the earth, if you like. So he wanted to remember, didn't want to forget. So he's a modernist with a difference. Instead of causing us to remember the past like old monuments, the new monuments seem to cause us to forget the future. Again, another paradox he's cited here. Instead of causing us to remember the past like the old monuments, the new monuments seem to cause us to forget the future. But very much configuring the effort to create within the network of memories which reside within that. And then the dynamic and dialectic between forgetting and remembering has always been coextensive. Or this is Pierre Huguet. I do not own modern times from 2006. But what's the meaning of I do not own modern times? The foundation of the notion of being contemporary is predicated not only on the great not only on the end of the great narratives that supported modernity, or even the passage into the micro narratives that mark post-modernity, but rather an emptying out of the impulses to progress within coherent schema. Thus, the contemporary is closer to being a mood, flavor, or even a taste of time. I don't think that's written anywhere. So these are some of the books we might turn to. Peter Osborne, Anywhere or Not at All, which is the idea of the contemporary being a kind of fiction of temporality, that we're still within modernity, even if it displays modernity. So whereas modernity is a stable historical category, Osborne claims that contemporary is a fiction as such as an unstable designation because it regulates the division between past and present within the present. So it's unstable because of that double bind, a blind spot built into it. This is Robert Longo, Men and Cities from the 1980s, New York artist. And Peter Osborne states, if modernity projects the present of the permanent transition, forever reaching beyond itself, the contemporary fixes or unfolds such transitoriness within the duration of a conjecture, or at its most extreme, the stasis of a present moment. Such presentness finds its representation form in the annihilation of temporality by the image. And here just one or two references. And indeed, this kind of relation between temporality and the image is felt most acutely in the work of Didier Huberman. He said we must know how to look at images to see that of which they are survivors, so that history, liberated from the pure past, the absolute, the abstraction, might help us to open out the present of time. And we find in the work of Didier Huberman and Carmen Voloda, undertaken studies respectively of Fra Angelico and Tintoretto in order to better understand late modern issues such as the image or the diagram, because they cannot be answered adequately within the schemas presented from within the passage of modernity itself. This idea of modernity not quite able to reveal its own mechanisms. If modernity throws up this desire for answers within its aesthetic order, then perhaps the contemporary passage cannot answer for itself at all. This is the dilemma of the present, how to discover the difference that makes the difference. I just finished up with Abby Warburg and his idea of iconology. I'll leave it there. I think we need a lot of discussion for this. Just So my last statement is the great mystery of modernity is how it managed to reverse its images of a better future, with one dominated by the figure of closure. Is the other of modernity to be realized within its extinction? And so Zizek um, attempts to uncover the intellectual impulses of modernity through the examination of idealist and romantic philosophy. There are various folds within the project. Lacan rereading Hegel and Schelling, and Lacan rereading Freud, and then Zizek's rereading of all these other folds, positive within the textual interplay, situated within this labyrinth is the speculative kernel or within modernity concealed by double binds that indicate in various passages of contemporary culture. Jokes, puns, paradoxes, blind spots all lead to the dark abyss of a culture bereft of self-realization. Um, Far away. I've worked from last week, but I felt it went together very well with the. It came out of the presentation on autonomy and a sense of where we are now with figures of thought. So who's going to start off?
It's a tough one to start off, and it's like so much stuff to take in. But maybe just on the last slide, because that is, well, all of it's of interest, but Slavoj Zizek and living in the end times, can maybe talk about kind of where he's coming from, and I think because it relates a bit to Peter Osborne as well.
Yeah, they're not. They're different, um, but they could share the same platform in that they both have investment within the idea of negation. So Peter Osborne's, you could say, is closest to Adorno and his idea of negation of society as a sort of modernist trope that art it finds its autonomy through a negative relationship to the social flux. So politics comes out of not a direct relationship to society, but an indirect relationship mediated by negation. So they're close in that respect. I don't think that Zizek more accurately could be described as part Marxist, but also Lacanian. And so he goes back to the influence of Hegel and the idea of the negation, which is found in Hegel's philosophy and Schelling also. It's Schelling who gives rise to the idea of the unconscious, who first uses systematically the idea of the unconscious, but related to nature. So Lacan was interested in Schelling for his idea of the unconscious, and Hegel as well. And also the idea of the split subject, which is found in Hegel, first of all, but also the roots of it are in Kant and the theory of knowability and unknowability. So that's just a sketch.
But you mentioned Kant, and then you started your talk with and you mentioned Kant and the subjective turn. And I guess that Kant and I guess started the idea of autonomy, the artist being autonomous or art being autonomous, and I guess the implication autonomous from society, which you've touched on, I guess negation of Zizek and Osborne. So how does that tie into, let's say, kind of some of the thinking in the art world in the last, say, 30 years, where it's very much culturally orientated? It seems to be diametrically opposed.
There's a fading of the concept of autonomy in the contemporary art. So one of the ways in which it becomes outside of modernity is in that fading of the figures of modernity. One of the figures is formalism of Kant, and another one is autonomy. So Kant relates not autonomy to society. I mean, his figure of genius is interesting, Kant, because he says that genius is that which is able to make a rule for itself, go outside of rule. So again, autonomy is related to that which posits its own rule. So it's not directly, genius and autonomy aren't necessarily wedded together, but they're related.
Thank you.
Jonathan,
What?
could you stop sharing your screen?
I've stopped sharing the screen.
Oh no, it's still there.
Still there, so we can't see each other at the minute because we've got your screen on the screen.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing the screen. Sorry, I'm back. I'm forgetting the procedure. I want to escape. I want to escape visuality. I want to be contemporary. I want to be able to forget.
Can I ask a really dumb question?
If it's dumb enough.
Well, I mean, as I've said to you before, I like really struggle with subject object. For some reason, I cannot hold the concept in my mind. And I must have looked it up like 200 times. And every time I look it up, like I get it when I look it up and I really think about it, and then it's gone again. For whatever reason, I just can't hold this concept. But I was curious, like, are you suggesting or are you saying that this subject object distinction is itself a feature of modernity and it didn't exist before that?
I'm saying something slightly different to that. I'm saying part of the anti-mimetic impulse within modernity opens out the question of that dualism and is a critique of that dualism and gives rise to the philosophies which wish to overcome it. And
so when did it originate from then? Subject object.
The Greeks.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
And it's within the code of reason. You have to have a distinction between the subject which comes to know and the knowable object or the object of attention. And that's partly what Oedipus tries to overcome is a critique of that philosophy of reason. That's another story, another time.
Is there somehow a logic that kind of sees modernity as playing out some type of reductionist view of the world? Finally, get that postmodernism rejects in favor of complexity. Is that one way of looking at the way things became?
There's a horizon within modernity, which is it does play out reductionism, and you get that within Greenbergian aesthetic theory, which is the ultimate in reduction, a finality of, and one of the reflexes against Greenberg is to not only reinvigorate other forms, performivity and feminism and so forth and so on, but open out a kind of new impulse towards overcoming binaries, whether it's male, female. I mean, the whole construction of binaries across the social matrix, which postmodernity attempted to address, and then becomes part and parcel of the contemporary, but assumes what's gained within postmodernity is assumed by the contemporary. So we don't have a struggle against postmodernity had a struggle against Greenberg and aesthetic formalism, but there was no assumption of that struggle within the contemporary. The contemporary just takes what it wants from modernity on the level of appearance, doesn't share its struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of the way things went in science, not just in philosophy. And I think somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s, there was this cry, which this is the title of some paper, which was called More is Different, which was attacking the way physics and the scientific community believed that it was everything could be reduced to could be understood in a reductionist sense, and the idea of complexity and emergence had emerged as a counter to that. And I think people like Deleuze were playing the exact same game. We're discussing the exact same possibilities in philosophy at the same time, and I think that's also true in Smithson's work as well. That all emerged, I think, at the end of the 60s, early 70s. And I think that, for me, is somehow a rejection of modernity. Yes, a rejection of Duchamp. It's all happening at that same time. And it's a fight against reductionism. I think even minimalism could be viewed in some sense as reduction.
Yeah, because it's also an introduction of minimalism, introduction of a time-based aesthetic, which is completely, I mean, it's denounced by formalists as being theatrical, not art. I mean, you could say there's a conflict which is built up within modernity between Cartesian reductionism, the production of the self-sane through method as truth, and aesthetics, which is the production of difference. And somehow they come to collide in the late 20th century. And all sorts of things happen as a fallout between that collision. So
also,
a lot of philosophers turn towards aesthetics in the late 20th century for their overcoming of the binary of object and subject.
I was also wondering about your feelings about earlier stuff. I don't know, the beginning of the 20th century, like Joyce and his, let's say, Finnegan's Wake. And this introduced the introduction of some type of complexity and reversal of the direction of playing with circularity of time.
Yeah.
Where do you see that? Is that a modernist or early?
It's modernist. It's modernist, but it jumps into postmodernism as well. So it's simultaneously both. There's one of the things we discover about this period we call modernism is that it's not as linear as it imagined itself to be. That it's more heterogeneous, that it's more paradoxical, there's more black holes in it than it would care to. I mean, a lot of modernity is quite dull because it's programmatic. It's not exactly Cartesian, but it's programmatic and repetitious, and modernity of rupture and rapture is the modernity we get interested in. We get interested in the modernity of aporia, of black holes, of, so in other words, the very metaphors which are part of physics, we embrace within modernity itself. It's a sort of learning which is outside of programmatic learning. We need another. We're going out of the mechanical age, and we've been too. I mean, Enlightenment and modernist thinking has been too bound with the machinic thinking, and we abandon that thinking now. We're post-industrial. We're full of virtuality and all sorts of paradoxes of temporality. So we're less inclined to think. We are modernists without being able to think through what it was like to be modernist and what it was like to resist modernity, or what it was like to be the difference within the difference of modernity. So we're the other of modernity. We're on the other side of modernity, but we still are probably in some ways touched by modernity quite deeply. So we're divided by modernity.
When you were talking about the themes and the ideas of modernity and post-modernity, is it right to almost imagine that the sort of the contemporary could almost sit as a subset inside these bigger ideas?
It's a way of dealing with ending, I think, and refusal to end. So kind of an afterwards of modernity, other of modernity, but a kind of a fixation upon it. So we hover around in the labyrinthine structure of a late modernity, not knowing how to escape it, not knowing how to name something differently from it, not knowing how to create the figures which would make the difference. I mean, a lot of contemporary art will be seen to be, over a period of time, pathetic.
It feels quite a poor relation.
Because it's bereft of its heroic element.
Yeah, it's not diving deep enough. It's not going where modernity or these ideas that you've discussed goes.
Mm.
It's not taking us there. It's a framework, but it's not digging or diving any deeper.
One thing that I'm wondering, in that sense, you mentioned before, Jonathan, that a lot of philosophers during modernity turns towards aesthetics. What you mean by that is they figured that the way to depict the world was aesthetic, because aesthetic permits to account for what cannot really be accounted for, or magic, as Federico Campagna would say. And it is needed in
what his main point of aesthetic theory, what he came to, he wasn't that interested in art necessarily, but he was interested in the relationship to freedom, to nature, in mediating that relationship. But he came to understand that there's some things which were non-conceptual, aconceptual. So aesthetics is a way of thinking about non-knowledge, really. And it persists within both philosophy and in art. It doesn't persist particularly in the university. They disavow this idea of non-knowledge because it's not convenient for it, but it's subversive of a kind of way of understanding knowability.
When you say he, you mean Greenberg?
No, I'm talking about, I said Kant.
Oh, Kant. I didn't hear Kant. Okay.
So Kant, his initial impulse was to, he saw there was a gap between freedom and nature in his theory. He never envisaged writing three critiques. He just logically progressed imminently across his two critiques and found he still had something to say which was outside of how the subject comes to know. So he gave birth to something that he didn't quite harvest himself. That's why you've got so much rereading of Kant, because it's not necessarily completely finished. The theory isn't finished. It's like artworks which aren't completely finished.
If I'm not mistaken, Kant doesn't believe in God, or doesn't account for God.
God is the guarantee. It's a displaced guarantee of theory. So it's not that he doesn't believe in God, he just displaces God. God is a guarantee, is not part of the theory of reason. Whereas in Spinoza, century earlier, God is part of the single substance. There's one substance, and God's included in that substance. That's monist thinking. There's no subject and object division. It's all one substance.
And so could that substance be what Kant missed, but sort of conceptualized with aesthetics, which are non-knowledge? And could that be a fair rereading of Kant?
It's extremely short rereading. But let's say, for the sake of shorthand, it's a good little pointer towards what the relationship might be.
Spinoza is effectively an atheist. Right? God becomes nature, or laws of nature. There's no God out. As long as there's no God outside, then it's God, and then God doesn't exist. So
Or you can say God disappears.
yeah, I mean, Leibniz, who was also a monist, rejected that and tried to introduce God into the monist world. So Spinoza did away with God. I don't know about Kant. Kant kind of doesn't care about God. It's not essential.
He has God, but he displays them. He was maybe still had memories of purges in former times. You better have God somewhere, but not too close.
I kind of forgot the distinction between presentation and representation, and feel that it probably is crucial to understanding that lecture you just gave.
Okay, so presentation is a journey of becoming, an exhibition. It's futural as well, because it's a journey into becoming. It touches what's to come. Representation is like a grid over reality. It's like a reductionist relationship between the model and the world. Gives coherence to as representations. It makes a picture, makes an image which can be drawn upon. The work of art presents its condition closer to presentation than representation.
So in that sense, the representation is outside of time and is almost empty, whereas the presentation is what encapsulates
It's
essence,
based on,
meaning.
I mean, Deleuze would say it's based on a stable identity. You've got to get stable points to make a grid over reality. You've got to get stable entities like identity in place. I think he says there's four component parts of representation. I forget them. If you write to me, I'll send you some notes. The stable identity is one of the most important things.
Stable identity as part of the representation.
Representation. You've got to have a point from which you cognize or cognizant.
his whole idea is against representation.
No, Deleuze that's his militancy. Before anything else is against representation. Because in a way, representation secures the relationship between object and subject, secures the distance.
Could you talk some more about virtuality? I see this used in academic writing quite a lot, and I'm not sure what it means in that context when it's used.
Patrick's better answer than me.
Well, I was interested by I can't remember what you said. You said something that I thought was interesting about virtuality when it came up. I wonder what virtuality is myself. Oh yeah, you said. When you were talking about loss of distinction and tonality, you introduced virtuality, and you've got this the abstract, you've got the real, then you've got the virtual, and I think the virtual to me is it's not an abstraction. It's something that's perfectly real. It's just not in existence. Sorry, that's not word. It's not something you can put your hands on. So, in a mathematical sense, it might be that you have some system that has all these virtual possibilities. They're all just as real as any of the other ones. I mean, one of them actually
is a capability of the reserve. It stands in waiting.
But it's not abstract. It's real.
It's real. So it's coming into being.
It's like potential then.
Potential was the word which was used probably in by say Aristotle, which would be in one of the meanings would be virtuality.
I once asked Johnny Golding about the virtual and Deleuze. She told me he was off his head when he came up with that, and she didn't believe any of it. So, and then that's why I was interested when you mentioned it, because
I was off my head.
I wondered if that was a common point of view.
I mean, the words slip and slide with me.
I know I keep noticing it pop in to people's language, and that I'm like, what are you saying when you do that? So thanks.
I mean, it might have a reference to, as it were, Deleuze, or it might have a reference previously to Bergson. And I mean, it's his way of trying to theorize cinema in particular. And it's a way of trying to deal with time.
I think actually Deleuze introduced it, first of all, in his writing in his book Bergsonism. I think that's when it first came up.
But it comes up in cinema. And he talks about I think it's in one of the films with it's a film. I've forgotten the film now. Stalker, I think it's in Stalker. He talks about Tarkovsky using virtual images. It's a landscape which is both actual and virtual. There's a kind of sense of some surplus, something which can't be spoken of, or something can't quite be shown. But it's a kind of reserve of something.
There's a book, I can't remember what it's called, Virtual Science, is it? I can't remember. It's by Delander, Manuel Delander, in which he writes about Deleuze's philosophy. And I think he basically is equating the virtual with dynamical systems there. He's now thinking about a dynamic system in the space it exists in, which is many, many more dimensions. There's one dimension for each degree of freedom.
And Jonathan,
Exploring that.
Oh,
Oh, sorry. Say
sorry,
again.
sorry, Patrick. Didn't mean to interrupt you. Are you finished?
No, sorry. So in this space, there are all the possibilities of what might happen. And I think Delander is trying to argue that that is what the virtual is for Deleuze. And it may be that when Deleuze was reading some mathematics, he picked up on that.
It's a kind of, you could call it a surplus. The surplus of the real, if you like, which has to pass through the real, has to go through the real to find it.
I think calling it a surplus sort of denigrates it.
It might do, but I'm just trying to find a word.
To me,
give me a break. I'm desperate.
Calling it potential is
I'm out of my depth.
Calling it potential is like elevating it above the real to me. Do you see what I mean? It's like like the real just becomes one instance of all the potential. Whereas if you call it a surplus, it's like it's that elevates the real by relation to the virtual, as I like hear that. To me, relating it to potential makes it sort of a priori, which gives it more stature.
And where do you think the work of somebody like Bill Viola would sit relative to the virtual?
Bill Viola. I mean, is less inclined to be related to virtual and more to the spiritual, Viola.
It is true. But would there be any equation between spirituality and the virtual, or just unrelated concepts?
I think you could eventually make a relationship, but I don't think it's made within Viola's work. I increasingly dislike Viola's work.
Why?
It's inflated. I mean, it's typical of, again, a postmodernist incorporation of incorporates formal features of modernity with a twist of postmodernity. And it inflates itself in the process. I mean, it's sort of goes for the profound by restaging. I mean, it's again a memory trait. It takes, say, Renaissance paintings and restages them, and in the restaging reveals the kind of inner feeling of these images, the surplus of these feelings. Let's use the word surplus in another way.
It's sort of sensationalized too. It feels very sensational, very amplified.
They become excessive for the sake of I mean, the opposite of Beckett, I think. Beckett is sparse and he's excessive. And so my sensibility goes with Beckett. I think it's more difficult, more
Subtle.
not just subtle, it's got a force to it. I don't find viola's got a force to it. It doesn't release force, it releases emotions. And it's almost, it's not exactly, it's not kitsch. But it's sticky. I mean, you have to, sometimes when you talking about a work of art, you have to release your own, you don't objectify it in art historical terms always. You have a relationship to it, which is, I mean, I was disinclined to like, for instance, Howard Hodgkin's work. I found it pretentious, his dating of things for 2 years or 3 years. I thought, I don't believe it. I think it's a kind of, is to give the work profundity that's not within the work. It's much more slight than that. I mean, I've kind of slightly, I sort of like the paintings more now than I did. But there's something about that stickiness within Hodgkin work, which I find in Bill Viola. I mean, I wouldn't write that. I'd have to find a way of writing it better to make it, it's got a prejudice to it. But sometimes prejudice can give rise to insight, not touched by darkness. I saw a show in the Whitechapel of Viola's work in the 90s. I was really impressed. I really was taken by it. I remember a work with these oil bins with water and with submerged screens in them. I thought, wow, it's really something. I really like the use of technology and the sort of raw relationship between an installation of these oil drums filled with water and these images glistening below the surface of the water. I thought there's a visuality which I admired then. But as he became more institutional, I found it less than I just couldn't deal with it, to say the least. But I have had a sort of positive relationship to his work, which I've moved away from. I don't think he'll be I don't know. Like, there's a lot of these figures in the art world which are overinflated, become very institutional and very processional. How's things going in Spain on you?
It's mixed, very frustrating, but at least I'm getting something done. And it looks like it's happening.
Good. That's what we want to hear.
Okay.
Bring back a report from Spain. When do you come back?
2nd of October.
Wow.
I'll show you what I've done so far. Just here, I'm just waiting for the driver. At least it's giving my sculpture a good home. So this is just like, so let's start. Let me just see if I can reverse the camera. Oh, there.
It's one of the reasons for this group is to report back from the work you're making.
So this is it so far. I mean, the lip is going to go up there. That's a museum they're building there. I'll show you the work of another artist. She's work, I really like her work. She gets very thin aluminium sheets, and because this island is volcanic, and it's protected. Puts them on the stones and uses a hammer to get shapes. Okay, hold on. There you go. That you can see. And stacking them up. See if you can you see? Yeah. Can you see it?
Just.
Yeah. Well, I will show you, give you a better view. Let me see if we can go up. It's just locked. Yeah, yes, I can. Just taking impressions of the volcanic scene. It's exciting. It's really very difficult. But it's exciting to be here. You see me? Yeah.
So where are you installing, Anya, and what is it for?
It's an international sculpture symposium. So every year they get a few artists to make permanent public sculptures in Puerto del Rosario, which is the capital of Fuerteventura, which is one of the Canary Islands. I was thinking, and for some strange reason I was picked. I didn't even apply, but I wasn't going to say no to this. And I was thinking, if one of you or the whole group wants to come up with a proposal, I can put them across to them. I think I know the lady who is the commissioner. She's a professor at the Art University in Tenerife. And I think there might be a chance. You never know. If you don't ask, you don't get. But I looked at the area view and there are not much colors here. And I thought, there are not much colors. I'm going to splash some colors. But it tells you that I know that with the intense sun and the wind and the bringing the salt and the sea and the water, all the colors fade.
That's an invitation already.
I did it, and I'm using like the best yacht paint you can buy.
Thank you for that. We look forward to the next feedback when it's finished. Good.
Thanks for the question. I'm sorry I was moving around, but you said I have to have the camera on.
Any more thoughts about the presentation today?
One thing I was thinking about appropriation in modernism and postmodernism. I was thinking about Art Nouveau, the way it like collect aesthetics from different periods, and then it generates something else, and then these this aesthetics is later reappropriated by different forms of modernism, of Art Nouveau elsewhere. So and yeah, so what would be the difference between the way the modernists were appropriating uh, uh, um, a cultural production and how um, the postmodernists would do? Would the difference would be, well, so what would be the difference? Is more like on the combination of
So with modernity, you've got to try and imagine what it was like in the late 19th, early 20th century. The kind of impulse towards social unease and revolution and challenge to tradition and stasis and hierarchy. So there's a kind of a move towards the democratic, towards the mass. And there's an introduction of technologies, and the unconscious comes in, the idea of infinity and fourth dimension and speed, and so kind of enormous release of energies and forces, which the academy can't really deal with. They have to go outside of the I have to go outside the authority figures. I have to go outside of set formulas for doing things, set methods for doing things. So it breaks open reality in a certain way. With post-modernity, it's much tamer. I mean, it's partly a return to the image, an appropriation of the image, a return to painting in particular, a return to the figural, and a kind of a disavowal of the main codes, the main narratives of like progress and reason, and it goes for minor narratives, goes for the heterogeneous, goes for the minor. It's a kind of re-engagement of the market. So late modernity, the market was dead to art. You could say that post-modernity revived the relationship to the market, or there was never a relationship to the market within modernity for young artists, but suddenly young artists could sell for what was then enormous amounts of money. It made art into a mainstream. It kind of reversed the relationship between mass culture and fine art culture or high culture. It mixed them up. It amplified a new rhythm of life, a new vitality, if you like. Mixed up codes, messed things up, displaced things, was anarchistic, and you could say the contemporary crept up on us because there was massive wealth generated in the global economy. Art became a major form of investment. So a lot of people kept 10% of their portfolios in art. Art started to be kept in warehouses around the world, in secure ports, and exchanged as a commodity, I mean, it really became it went from being a millionaire's game to being a billionaire's game. So a massive change that modernity always had hidden within it a kind of resistance to the market, even though it was compliant in many ways. All that rhetoric of anti-market, anti-capital went away within the contemporary. It was like a race to make as much money as possible. So artists became Jeff Koons, Damien Hirst, all these big figures. Murakami had factories of 200 workers, 300 workers producing these things in different, like a fashion company making diffuse lines, and you'd buy hundreds of casts, heads by Damien Hirst with like shiny bits of plastic. That every level of the market was exploited, so it became part of the fabric of production. It wasn't exclusive. So modernity started off as an obscure rejection of the academy with minority collectors, and became a sort of huge business within the contemporary. And we look at the forgetting of codes as being part of that kind of flaccid relationship to resistance to the social. It's not speech for everything. There was still great art produced, but the period itself, the classification is dismal. It's a bubble that's burst now, or is about to burst.
Jonathan, sorry to interrupt you in such a brilliant flow there. I was just wondering about the codes that you're talking about, and the forgetting of the codes. Are you talking about the purposeful forgetting and changing of the codes in modernity, or are you talking about some other sort of forgetfulness of?
The codes were the inherited codes of the Enlightenment, which was towards progress, reason, a sort of utopian future, perfection of the future, completion. These are all great narratives, what Lyotard calls the great narratives of modernity. They kept the mass culture and high culture apart. That was another coding, structural dislocation. So we have dislocations, and we have codes, and we have a kind of certain sort of ethics, certain kind of idea of autonomy is another code. Sort of idea of truth could be just truth to materials, but these are all enshrined within modernity, give modernity a purity, a transpersonal, regulative. I mean, it gave an impulse towards the avant-garde. The avant-garde thought it was getting somewhere. There was somewhere to go. There's this sort of period of one negation after another negation. So it gave energetics to the proceedings, and gave a schema to the museums in which to organize itself. So it was a didacticism of its own figuration. This is why postmodernity introduced minor narratives for the disavowal of these major narratives, introduced irony and loops and puns, as it were. There's a lot of punning within, a lot of appropriation which punned upon the origins. So it kind of played upon remembering and forgetting. So it didn't take itself so seriously, but it was also a kind of new scale of image making. So we find work by Kiefer, for instance, painted by Kiefer, could be, or an installation by Kiefer. There's almost a feeling that you could put speakers either side of his paintings and play opera. There's something grandiose about postmodernity as well. It sort of elevated itself, exceeded itself, was excessive as itself. But it forgot the codes at the same time, or was as a kind of defied modernity through forgetting. And the contemporary it can't keep up with that energetics, so it introduced another energetics of a mass production of art, a kind of a play with market forces and cleverness and quotation, and a play between you don't know whether the artist is forgetting that he or she saw something, or is meaningly not letting you on to the secret of something. So it's kind of there's a sort of running out of syntax. There's not the impulse towards the new anymore. So it takes an energetics to have an impulse towards the new. So, I mean, one of the things which secures modernity as memory is its energetics towards the new. Is wanting to supersede itself, wanting to come to some future which it couldn't yet imagine. It's contemporary is exhaustion of that energetics. It's the collapse of the feeling that there's anywhere to go other than to possibly extinction, or to a dismal future or an exhausted future.
So then in that so currently we're looking at kind of a new futurism, which seems full of hope, speculative, works, and like speculating on even like dystopic futures, or how do you see that? Is it that like beyond contemporary?
Well, maybe it's the bubble that bursts to contemporary, because it reenacts an impulse which was found within early modernity. So maybe that memory is coming back to us, or coming back to certain people, or certain groups, or certain networks, and is being restaged and reenacted because of a desire. But it's a desire rather than something closer to a desire than to something which can have the same sort of impact as historical futurism. Because it's not got the machine energetics connected to it. It's not got the noise. It's not got the social disorder and the...
No, it's got the hope of the metaverse or something, like the hope of some fifth dimensional aspect.
Sorry, what is being meant by energetics?
All systems run on energy, and all forms organize that energy. So energy is constant, but the way it's organized relates to social form and technology and to aesthetic configuration. Instead of looking at form, look at energy. We don't speak of energy enough, I don't think, in arts.
I think it's all I talk about in art.
You talk about it now. Give us an insight into why you talk about energetics.
Well, just because I think to your point, we are, it's more, you might say form or matter, right? That we know that we are both physical and energetic in nature, but we are completely preoccupied with our physicality. And we think of energy generally as something outside of us. We recognize that there is energy, but we don't think of ourselves as energy. But actually, we know that we are energy, but it hasn't hit our consciousness yet. We still think it's something other outside of, not related to us, rather than it actually being us.
You could say this group's an energetic configuration before anything else. And it runs on this configuration. Or it fades with this figuration, or it's elevated with this figuration. We'll come to define it better in the future.
May I ask about automatic drawing or sculpting or writing for that matter?
Why?
Because I find it to be one way in which we can become, by thinking about the experience we've had when we're in that sort of trance of making whatever we're making, we can become conscious of the fact that there is indeed something circulating within us, energetic, regardless of our conscious awareness or not. So something has happened through us, energetically, but our mind was switched off. What I mean by mind is our conscious awareness of making what we're making wasn't there. And that to me seems to be extremely spiritual. It's becoming, once you become aware that you had that experience, it's becoming aware of spirits within you, which is beyond you.
Well, you don't have to get me to talk now. You've articulated what you want to say.
I was curious to have perspectives or counter arguments on what I said.
Yeah, I'll deal with it when we do the spiritual encounter presentation. In 2 weeks' time, we do presentations of abstracts. So next week, what's the consensus?
Jonathan, do you think, because we've I was just going to say, we've had one session of this new format, but not everybody was at that first session. So I think it's probably a good idea to recap not only on the writing exercises, but generally how we're organizing ourselves.
You give the recap.
No, that's all right. You can give.
Okay, the recap is this. The recap is this. It's that this is an autonomous group outside of the RCA, although everyone's passed through the RCA or is about to pass through the RCA. But we define it.
Recording stopped.
We